Hello everyone, I am Abdulaziz Al-Emrani and welcome to my lecture on Orientalism and Postcolonialism. This brief lecture is for my course Introduction to Cultural Studies. It goes without saying that Western knowledge about the Orient was intimately connected with colonialism. And of course, when we talk about the Orient, we refer to the East. The societies and peoples who inhabit the places of Asia and Africa. Colonialism not only operated as a form of military and economic domination, but also as a discourse of domination. For European colonialism, the vast continent of Africa was a haunt of savages, replete with superstitions and fanaticisms, and was held in contempt and considered cursed by God. Ever since the publication of Edward Said's seminal work entitled Orientalism, which was published in 1978, the connection between knowledge and power cannot be ignored. Drawing on Michel Foucault's thesis that knowledge is inextricably linked with power, Edward Said shows that the production of knowledge about the Orient by the West is not an innocent activity. So, the Orientalist pursuit of knowledge was inextricably bound up with the desire for colonial expansion and domination. Said shows also how, in the case of the Orient, knowledge and power went hand in hand, undermining the possibility of an objective and unbiased academic standpoint. Put differently, Said's Orientalism is a genealogical account of the development of an Orientalist discourse in France, Britain, and America, through which he traces a line of connection between seemingly unconnected texts. It successfully challenges us to consider, to what extent, seemingly neutral disciplines such as philology, science, or travel writing can display, perpetuate, and indeed be colonialist. Edward Said's central contention is that Orientalism was a systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. In this sense, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Said, therefore, classifies Orientalism in three distinct but interdependent categories. First, as an academic discipline that is perpetuated in doctrines about the Orient. Secondly, as a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. Finally, as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient in order to dominate and control it. Orientalism is not just in a set of false assumptions and stereotypes about the East that pervade the Western atmosphere. It is indeed an ideological tool of imperialism designed to ease Western dominance of the Orient. As a body of ideas, cliches, attitudes, and images about the Orient, Orientalism, well-intentioned or not, was a discourse serving imperialist and colonialist aims. The prevailing attitude behind colonialism was that of the white man's burden, to use Rudyard Kipling's phrase, that it was the moral duty of Europeans to civilize other primitive nations. For instance, the British saw their colonial rule over India as being for the Indians' own good. It is widely accepted that texts, such as documents, books, and literature of various kinds, played an important role in the colonial enterprise. For example, William Shakespeare's The Tempest and Othello, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Lord Jane, Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, Henry Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines, and Rudyard Kipling's Scam celebrate and disseminate the ideologies of empire, such as those stressing the nobility, civility, uniqueness, and knowledge of the European. To illustrate, William Shakespeare's The Tempest supports the establishment of colonies and the exercise of slavery in America, Africa, and Australia. Whatever relation it has with the New World, The Tempest does register and enact a colonial encounter through the conflicting relation of two emblematic characters, Prospero and Caliban. Also, Edith Wharton's travelogue in Morocco also endorses French colonialism of Morocco. Edith Wharton's book gives positive representations of French colonialism of Morocco. It serves the agenda of the French protectorate, praising and advocating it by claiming that it saves Moroccan culture and history from destruction. According to Edward Said, Orientalism is a hegemonic discourse that evolved out of strength and was recognized officially, academically, and strategically as knowledge in order to rationalize and justify the West's long history of military rule, economic exploitation, and cultural hegemony. Edward Said also argues that Orientalism can be found in current Western depictions of Arab cultures. The depiction of the Arab as irrational, untrustworthy, anti-Western, and terrorist is very common in a number of Western, mainly American movies and novels. Therefore, the Orient for Said was almost a European invention and had been since antiquity a place of romance and exotic beings. In fact, Said was particularly influential for his denunciation of imperial ideologies, which were seen to infantilize, demonize, and feminize non-Western cultures and peoples as other. Without a doubt, Edward Said's evaluation and critique of the set of beliefs known as Orientalism forms an important background for the birth of a new field of study called postcolonial studies. One of the most important intellectual movements of the last 50 years in the Western academy is that which travels under the name postcolonialism or postcolonial studies. Beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a field of academic study emerged, mostly associated with literary studies, which went by the name postcolonial studies. Some would date its rise in the Western Academy from the publication of Edward Said's influential critique of Western constructions of the Orient in his 1978 book Orientalism. The growing currency within the academy of the term post-colonial was also consolidated by the appearance in 1989 of the Empire Writes Back Theory and Practice in Post-Colonial Literatures by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffith, and Helen Tiffin. Since then, post-colonialism has proven to be one of the most diverse and contentious fields in literary and cultural studies. Post-colonialism is a dynamic, interdisciplinary, and a multifaceted process, and it has developed out of European traditions of thought, namely structuralism, post-structuralism, nationalism, postmodernism, feminism, Marxism, and secular humanism. Post-colonialism can be defined as a discursive study of the ideological and cultural aftermath of Western colonialism. As a form of cultural and intellectual decolonization, post-colonialism involves a studied engagement with the experience of colonialism and its past and present effects. Post-colonialism also involves the discussion of experiences such as slavery, migration, suppression and resistance, difference, race, gender, religion, and place, as well as responses to the Eurocentric discourses of the West, such as history, philosophy, and anthropology. Post-colonial critics and theorists use post-colonialism as a critical tool to examine the legacy of colonialism, as well as to reread and reinterpret Western canonical literature from a variety of fresh and diverse perspectives. Significantly, post-colonial critics and theorists strike and write back to the center. For instance, Gayatri Spivak, a famous post-colonial theorist and critic, commenting on Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, writes that 19th century British literature cannot be read without remembering that imperialism, understood as England's social mission, was a crucial part of the cultural representation of England to the English. She also argues that all 19th century British literature contains and conveys imperial messages, and to ally this contention with the fact that a notion of English literature as a subject, meaning as a set of texts conveying English cultural superiority, came into being in 19th century British India. Homi Bhabha is also one of the founding fathers of post-colonial studies, along with Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak. And although he is inspired by Edward Said's Orientalism, he blames Said for claiming that colonial discourse is singular and homogeneous, the mistake that Edward Said corrects later in his book entitled Culture and Imperialism. For Bhabha, the Orientalist discourse is heterogeneous and hybrid, and hence he coins concepts which are considered the key concepts in post-colonial studies, such as hybridity, mimicry, ambivalence, and the third space in his reading and analysis of the Western literary and cultural representations of the subaltern other. Postcolonialism is also concerned with the literary and cultural productions of the ex-colonized societies. For example, post-colonial literary works include Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, Tayyip Salah's Season of Migration to the North, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Grain of Wheat, Toni Morrison's Beloved, Zadie Smith's White Teeth, and among many others. To illustrate, Achebe's Things Fall Apart is all about the collapse, breaking into pieces, chaos, and confusion of traditional Igbo culture that suffers at the hand of the white man's arrival in Umuofia along with his religion. Achebe wants to restore the true image of Africa and help his people rediscover a cultural heritage lost under the traumatic impact of British colonization. In other words, the message that Chinua Achebe wants to convey in his Things Fall Apart is that African people didn't hear of culture for the first time from Europeans, and that their societies were not mindless but frequently had a philosophy of great depth, value and beauty, that they had poetry, and above all they had what we call dignity. It is this dignity that many African people lost during the colonial period, and it is this that they must now regain. Seen in this light, post-colonial literary texts seek to undermine, subvert, and transform the dominance of Eurocentric colonial discourses, as well as to celebrate the cultural hybridity and diversity of the post-colonial societies. In brief, post-colonialism gives voice to the voiceless and visibility to the invisible. It disturbs the order of the world. It threatens privilege and power. It refuses to acknowledge the superiority of Western cultures. Its radical agenda is to demand equality and well-being for all human beings on this earth. Unlike those who have already declared the death of post-colonialism, I strongly believe that post-colonialism is still relevant today. Old and new forms of imperialism are still very much with us. When colonialism finally ended, the big Western powers couldn't afford to keep their hands completely off their colonies. As a politics and philosophy of activism, post-colonialism is still a crucial interpretative tool for understanding today's global issues. Let's leave it there, and thank you for listening.